the wet market didn't sell bats, it sold pangolins and others. So now you got to go bat to pangolin to.
Not lab or not, but did they do it on purpose? And if they did do it on purpose, you allude to this. There's one line in this book. I ripped it out here, China's negligence, and then you go parentheses, or worse, caused a local outbreak to become a pandemic. Is that what you were hinting at? Or worse, even if it was from a lab, it wasn't an accident that it actually, if you line up the past 9 months, I'd actually mean, I'm not wishing for death of anyone or harm to anyone, but I'd actually say if you look at the state of the CCP, the turmoil in the United States, taking Hong Kong, all the other things that are happening, it's actually worked out pretty well for China.
Yeah, well, that's a lot to unpack. Let's take it one step at a time. So let's just start with the, I did two things. There was some hard evidence. There's more today, and it all leans in favor of the virus coming from the laboratories. There's more evidence today, but there was enough last spring to present both sides and reach that conclusion, which I did. But I did it in two steps. One was just look at the evidence, the arguments pro and con. And when you get to the wet market theory, it came from a bat. Well, that's interesting. The particular bat that has been identified as having the coronavirus that got into humans, the ones where the COVID-19. Well, the COVID-19 is the disease, and SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. They have two different names, but the actual virus, very little doubt it originated from bats, but those bats were not within 100 miles of the wet market. That wet market didn't sell bats. Some do. This wet market did not sell bats. And if you said, oh, which bat, where do they live? It's 100 miles away. So one bat flew in and, dropped some teardrops or something in the market, flew back 100 miles, and no, that doesn't hold up. But those are facts. Those have been attested to. And then there was, again, hard evidence, State Department communications, where we in the United States, that is, had partially funded that laboratory. So we had some oversight ability, and the State Department sent a team of experts in there, and they wrote a report. This is before the pandemic. So this was, but not long before, maybe 6 months or so before. And they said this laboratory does not meet its own self-established standards. The procedures are sloppy. We see negligence, et cetera. So you already had a report saying that the lab was sloppy. The lab itself has admitted they were doing those kinds of experiments on the bat coronavirus. The wet market didn't sell bats, it sold pangolins and others. So now you got to go bat to pangolin to, it gets highly attenuated. But there's more. And then at this point, I sort of segue from the hard evidence that we had at the time. Again, give both sides, but definitely leaning in favor of the laboratory too. It's sort of a verbal or written version of Bayes' rule. Now, without getting too deep in the weeds and statistics, and this is something I learned in the intelligence community, working with the CIA for 10 years. You take someone like Janet Yellen. She was the chairman of the Fed. Now she's the Secretary of the Treasury. She's a statistics geek, but she's what you call a frequentist. And frequentist statistics means give me more data. The more data I get, the longer the time series. I can do the regressions and the correlations, and I can establish causality and make a prediction based on that. That's a frequentist. What do you do if you're trying to prevent the next 9/11, which I was and others were, and you only had one 9/11? Janet Yellen would say, well, let's have 10 more, let's have 30,000 dead, and then we'll have a time series and we can figure it out. Sorry, our job is to prevent the next one. Now, so how do you solve problems where you either don't have enough information, or maybe you have no information, but it's life or death? You have to solve it anyway. I always say, if you have enough information, a smart high school kid can solve the problem. The intelligence community and others, people in science and others, get the problems where you don't have enough information.
Life does not operate with perfect information. It's just not reality.
That's right. And sometimes you have to operate with no information. So what do you do?
Especially when they kick out all the journalists, when they don't allow any international commissions to come into the country, when Australia says, hey, let's have an independent review, and China literally goes full war on Australia, just say, let's have an independent review. Then they literally force themselves into having raging energy blackouts across all of China because they don't want to buy Australian coal anymore. Correct. It smells a little funny.
Well, no, but that's it. Okay, let's just take that as a good example. And the way Bayes works is you start out with a guess, and this is what people like Janet Yellen hate it. We don't want guesses. We want more data. Well, sometimes you make a guess. You make an intelligent guess based on whatever you have, and it may be pocket litter or scraps or rumors, and it may just be based on history. But you make a guess. But then what you do, that's your prior. But then what you do is you get subsequent data, and this is what the geeks hate about Bayes, because you're working backwards. You make a guess that may not be based on a lot, but as you get subsequent data, you go back and you ask a question. You say, what is the contingent probability or the conditional probability that the second data point would be true if my guess were correct, or false for that matter? And then you say, how likely is it this would have happened if my guess was correct? If the answer is there's no way this happens unless you're right about this, you go back and you increase the probability that the guess was right. Well, if you get 20 data points and you go back and every one of them conditionally confirms the original guess, that you might get to a 90% probability level, even though you started out at 50-50. But it's basically using the posterior information to update the prior. So, and there's a math formula for it, but that's how we do intelligence work. Well, I applied that to solving the problem of, did the virus come from a lab or not? And I asked myself a series of questions. I said, would you have, if you want to get to the bottom of this, would you have sent a team in, stripped the wet market, scrubbed it from top to bottom with disinfectants and alcohol, and eliminated every trace of everything if you were trying to figure out what happened? Would people have disappeared? Would papers have been erased from the web? Would you have sent, and all these things are true, by the way, they happened. Would you have sent a major general from Beijing, who's the head of Chinese germ warfare program, to be the temporary director of the lab if the lab didn't have a problem and it wasn't the source? And when you frame it that way, it's like, gee, if the lab wasn't the problem, why would you send a major general of germ warfare from Beijing to Wuhan to take over the lab? Well, the answer is you wouldn't, because that wasn't the problem. Well, clearly it was the problem. And so, and then would you start a major trade war with one of your largest trading partners at the mere suggestion that we have an independent inquiry? Well, if you had nothing to hide, you wouldn't do that. But if you had a lot to hide, you would do that. So when I go through 10 or 15 questions like that, but obviously the answer to every one is, we wouldn't be doing this, or this wouldn't be true unless it came from the laboratory. So combining the weight of Bayes' theorem updated with posterior information with the hard data we had at the time, I reached the conclusion that it did come from the laboratory. But having said that, I got a little flack from some early readers, and
this was back end of Q2, right?
I did this work in May. I wrote this in May, early June. So I went out on a limb, but I felt very comfortable doing so because I thought the evidence and my methodology were sound. I'll leave it to the reader. The only footnote I would drop is that the very recent evidence, U.S. intelligence collections and other sources, literally in the last couple of weeks after the book went to press,